Tonight, the first topic we explore is the life and legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt, a First Lady unlike any before her. A towering figure not just in American politics, but in the global struggle for human rights. From the halls of the White House to the chambers of the United Nations, Eleanor shaped the 20th century with her quiet determination and unshakable principles. So, before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we're working on some boring ones. Now it's time to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight, together. Eleanor Roosevelt's life began on the surface with privilege. Born into one of New York's most prominent families on October 11, 1884. But beneath that surface was a quiet and lingering sadness. Her early years were not filled with laughter or light, but with loss, isolation, and longing for love. Her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, was a stunning socialite, elegant, charming, and painfully critical. She often mocked Eleanor's plain appearance, calling her granny for her solemn expressions and awkward manners. To Eleanor, her mother's approval always felt out of reach, and her father, Elliott Roosevelt, brother of future President Theodore Roosevelt, was her one source of affection. But even that was taken from her. Elliott was charismatic, but consumed by alcoholism, a man whose warmth flickered in and out like candlelight in a storm. When Eleanor was only 8 years old, her mother died of diphtheria. Just 2 years later, her beloved father passed as well, after being confined to an asylum. By the age of 10, Eleanor was orphaned, carrying a heart full of grief into the cold care of her grandmother. The next few years were filled with formality, silence, and the stiffness of upper-class expectations. Eleanor, tall and shy, often felt invisible in her own home. But during those years, she began to develop her most enduring trait, resilience. She read voraciously, reflected deeply, and began to build a world inside herself where dignity did not depend on beauty or praise. At 15, her life changed dramatically. She was sent abroad to Allenswood Academy, a progressive school for girls near London. There, under the guidance of headmistress Marie Souvestre, Eleanor flourished. Souvestre believed in challenging convention and awakening young women to injustice. For the first time, Eleanor's intelligence and empathy were not only seen, but encouraged. She was taught to speak, to think, and to question. Those years in England left a lasting mark. The girl who once whispered in rooms became a young woman unafraid to speak, to feel, and to act. Eleanor returned to America different, still quiet, still modest, but with a deeper sense of purpose. She had known pain, and because of it, she would spend the rest of her life trying to ease it in others. When Eleanor Roosevelt returned from England, she re-entered a world of polished manners and social obligations. At age 20, she found herself drawn to a young man from her extended family, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was charming, confident, and ambitious. Like her, he was a Roosevelt, though from the Hyde Park branch, and a fifth cousin by blood. Their courtship, though not fiery, was steady, and in 1905, Eleanor married him in a modest ceremony attended by none other than President Theodore Roosevelt, her uncle, who walked her down the aisle. In the beginning, Eleanor did what was expected of her. She settled into the traditional role of wife and mother, managing household affairs and giving birth to 6 children, though only 5 would survive infancy. The early years were difficult. Her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, held a tight grip on the household and often made Eleanor feel like a guest in her own life. Sarah made the decisions, even on how the children were raised, and Eleanor, with her quiet demeanour, often yielded. Yet beneath that quiet, something was stirring. Eleanor began volunteering with social reform groups and found joy in serving the less fortunate. In the dim tenements and settlement houses of New York's poor, She saw the faces of people society had forgotten and felt something awaken inside her. Then came the Great Fracture. In 1918, Eleanor discovered love letters between Franklin and her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The betrayal cut deep. Eleanor offered divorce, but Franklin, pushed by political advisors and family, chose to remain married. The emotional closeness between them faded. From that moment forward, their partnership transformed into something more strategic than romantic. But, out of heartbreak, Eleanor found a kind of freedom. With her illusions shattered, she began carving out an identity separate from her husband's shadow. No longer simply the supportive spouse, she started to write, to organize, to speak. Their marriage endured, but on new terms. Franklin continued his political ascent, and Eleanor stepped boldly into the public sphere. What had begun as a conventional union now became something else entirely, a complicated alliance between two people with intersecting dreams, bound by duty and a shared vision for a better country. And for Eleanor, that was only the beginning. For much of her early adult life, Eleanor Roosevelt lived in the background, dutiful, observant, and quiet. But a sudden crisis would change everything. In 1921, Franklin was struck by a severe illness. At first, doctors thought it was a minor infection, but soon the diagnosis came: polio. It left him paralyzed from the waist down, a devastating blow for a man on the rise in American politics. As Franklin withdrew to Hyde Park for recovery, Eleanor stepped forward. At first, it was out of necessity, attending public events in his place, reading letters aloud to him, managing schedules and correspondence. But gradually, something inside her shifted. The shy young woman, once content to fade into the wallpaper, was finding her voice, and she began to use it. With Franklin's blessing, she threw herself into work. She joined the League of Women Voters, the Women's Trade Union League, and the Democratic Party's Women's Division. She gave speeches, campaigned for progressive candidates, and visited factories and poor neighborhoods. Eleanor was no longer simply helping Franklin. She was becoming a leader in her own right. This period was also marked by new and meaningful relationships. She met journalist Lorena Hickok, affectionately known as Hick. Their friendship was intense and deeply personal. Through thousands of letters exchanged over the years, we see Eleanor as she rarely appeared in public, vulnerable, passionate, and full of longing. These letters hint at a connection that may have gone beyond friendship. But more importantly, they show Eleanor as a woman unafraid to seek closeness and emotional honesty, despite the boundaries of her time. Eleanor also found strength in other communities, women activists, social reformers, and educators, who welcomed her not as a political wife, but as a peer. She travelled across the country, often alone, often to places most women of her class would never dare to go. Coal mines, sweatshops, immigrant schools. She didn't just want to know the issues, she wanted to see them, touch them, and feel them herself. By the late 1920s, she was no longer simply Franklin's wife. She was Eleanor Roosevelt, writer, speaker, teacher, and advocate. The foundation of her public identity had been built brick by brick through experience, heartbreak, and moral clarity. The world was beginning to notice, and soon they'd see her on an even bigger stage. In 1933, as the country reeled from the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. Millions tuned in to hear his promise of a New Deal, a bold plan to revive a broken economy. But while all eyes were on the new president, quietly beside him stood a woman who would soon transform what it meant to be First Lady. No one expected Eleanor Roosevelt to take a leading role in government affairs. Traditionally, First Ladies hosted events, stood by their husbands, and remained largely silent. But Eleanor was not interested in tradition. Within weeks of moving into the White House, she began carving out a space of her own. She started by travelling, often alone, without fanfare or photographers. She visited coal miners in Appalachia, farmers in the Dust Bowl, and black families in the segregated South. She listened to their stories with quiet attentiveness, not as a politician's wife, but as a fellow American who cared. What she saw horrified her: poverty, discrimination, and desperation. And so she wrote about it. Every day, in her syndicated column My Day, she described what she witnessed. Through plain, unpolished language, she spoke directly to the people, and the people listened. She was the First Lady to hold regular press conferences, and she insisted that only women reporters could attend. At a time when female journalists were often overlooked, Eleanor created opportunities just by existing in power differently. But her actions drew criticism. Some called her unladylike. Others accused her of meddling. Political cartoons mocked her big teeth and strong opinions. Yet she refused to shrink herself for comfort. She said what she believed, even if it made others uneasy. She championed causes that were years ahead of their time: affordable housing, child welfare, racial justice. She didn't wait for permission. She moved. And while Franklin led the nation through crisis, Eleanor became his most trusted advisor. She slipped him notes after dinner, telling him what people in forgotten corners of the country were really saying, what they needed, what they feared, and what they hoped. She wasn't just reshaping the role of First Lady, she was reshaping the country's understanding of leadership itself. As Eleanor Roosevelt's public role grew, so did her courage. In an America still deeply divided by race, class, and gender, she chose to confront injustice head-on, often at great personal and political cost. She believed that public service meant more than ceremony. It meant using her platform to challenge silence, even when doing so ruffled the most powerful feathers. One of her most defining moments came in 1939. World-renowned black opera singer Marian Anderson had been invited to perform in Washington, D.C., but the Daughters of the American Revolution, who owned Constitution Hall, refused to let her sing there because of the color of her skin. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the group, but she didn't try to mediate behind closed doors or soften the scandal. Instead, she publicly resigned and published her resignation letter in newspapers across the country. Her words were simple but clear. You had an opportunity to lead in an enlightened way, and you failed. But she didn't stop there. With Eleanor's support, Marian Anderson performed an open-air concert at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday. Over 75,000 people stood in silence as Anderson sang, her voice echoing off the very monument to freedom. And beside her, though not on the stage, stood the First Lady who made it possible. Eleanor's commitment to racial justice was rare in Washington at the time. She frequently invited black leaders to the White House, including educator Mary McLeod Bethune, whom she considered a close friend and advisor. She used her column to call out discrimination, whether in housing, employment, or education. And she did so knowing it would cost her political capital, and sometimes even safety. During World War II, she opposed the internment of Japanese Americans, one of the darkest decisions in US wartime history. She visited the camps, spoke to detainees, and later called the internment a tragic mistake, well before many others dared to speak out. Eleanor understood the cost of truth-telling, but she also knew that silence was more dangerous. Her moral compass rarely wavered, and it led her into places where few First Ladies had ever gone, not for applause, but for justice. And this fierce loyalty to human dignity would soon take her far beyond the White House. From the outside, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt's marriage looked like a classic political partnership, refined, poised, and united. But beneath the surface was a far more intricate emotional landscape, one shaped by betrayal, forgiveness, distance, and unexpected sources of love and companionship. Their union had already shifted after Franklin's affair with Lucy Mercer was exposed in 1918. Eleanor never truly recovered from the pain. Though they remained married and continued their political collaboration, the intimacy they once shared quietly dissolved. They lived increasingly separate lives, often in different parts of the White House, linked more by duty than by affection. Eleanor, in search of emotional connection, formed deeply meaningful relationships with others, most notably with Lorena Hickok, a sharp-witted Associated Press reporter known simply as Hick. Their correspondence, preserved in thousands of letters, reveals a powerful bond. Eleanor's words were tender, vulnerable, and at times poetic. She called Hick darling, and longed for her company when they were apart. Whether romantic or not, the relationship was undoubtedly one of the most emotionally fulfilling of Eleanor's life. She also built close friendships with other women, activists, journalists, educators, many of whom provided companionship, stimulation, and the intellectual warmth she rarely found in her marriage. These friendships sustained her, anchoring her through the chaos of public life and the solitude of personal disappointment. Meanwhile, Franklin maintained his connection with Lucy Mercer. After Eleanor's discovery, they agreed never to divorce, primarily for political reasons, but the emotional threads between Franklin and Lucy were never fully severed. In fact, it was Lucy who was quietly by Franklin's side when he died in 1945, something Eleanor only discovered afterward. The revelation reopened old wounds, but by then, Eleanor had long since learned to carry heartbreak without letting it break her. Despite all this, Eleanor and Franklin remained a formidable team. She advised him on legislation, whispered insights from her travels across the country, and kept him connected to the people beyond Washington's polished walls. She was, in many ways, his conscience. Their relationship defied simple definitions. More than a love story, not quite a friendship, never fully a political act. It was, like Eleanor herself, complicated, dignified, and deeply human. When President Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945, many assumed Eleanor Roosevelt would quietly step away from public life. She had served her time, they thought. She had been First Lady longer than any woman in history. Surely now she would retreat, perhaps to write memoirs, tend to grandchildren, or rest after years of tireless work. But Eleanor had no interest in fading into the background. In truth, her most impactful chapter was just beginning. Later that same year, President Harry Truman asked her to serve as a delegate to the newly formed United Nations. Many were surprised. She wasn't a trained diplomat, she wasn't a lawyer, she was a widow in her 60s. But Truman saw something others didn't: her deep moral authority, her experience with injustice, and her rare ability to speak to the world not as a politician, but as a human being. Eleanor accepted. And as she stepped into the halls of the United Nations, she carried with her more than just experience. She carried the voices of the forgotten. She was soon appointed chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights. It was a daunting task. The world was still recovering from the ashes of World War II. Millions dead, cities destroyed, nations fractured. The Holocaust had revealed horrors too great for words. And now, somehow, the world was supposed to agree on a shared vision of human dignity. Eleanor led the way. She worked day and night with delegates from across the globe. Men and women of different faiths, ideologies, and politics. The room was often tense, voices raised, compromise elusive. But Eleanor, with her calm persistence and quiet authority, guided them forward. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. It was a groundbreaking document that outlined in simple language the fundamental rights every person on Earth is entitled to, regardless of race, nationality, gender, or creed. Eleanor Roosevelt called it her proudest achievement. She had stepped onto the world stage not as a queen, not as a general, not as a president, but as a voice of moral clarity. She believed in the dignity of every life, and now that belief had been etched into history. Eleanor had become not just America's First Lady, but the world's. Even after helping to shape one of the most important documents in modern history, Eleanor Roosevelt didn't rest. In her later years, she remained a towering presence, writing, speaking, and travelling the world to champion the causes she believed in. If anything, the end of her time in the White House had freed her. Now, unbound by ceremonial duties, she could be fully and unapologetically herself. Throughout the 1950s, she wrote prolifically: columns, essays, and books. Her voice became a fixture in American households, not just as a reminder of the past, but as a guide for the future. She weighed in on civil rights, education, women's empowerment, nuclear disarmament, and more. People didn't always agree with her, but they respected her because she never pandered. She simply told the truth as she saw it. She continued to advocate for civil rights long before it was considered politically safe. She met with black leaders, visited segregated schools, and supported court decisions that pushed for racial equality. In many ways, she was a bridge between the older world and the emerging one, someone whose influence reached from the New Deal to the civil rights movement. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, Eleanor was initially hesitant to support him. She worried he wasn't fully committed to civil rights. But over time, they developed a mutual respect. Kennedy admired her tenacity and moral backbone, and she, in turn, encouraged him to listen more closely to the voices of the marginalized. After his election, he appointed her to chair his Commission on the Status of Women, yet another avenue for her to champion justice. By now, her health was beginning to decline. Decades of tireless work had taken a toll, but even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp. She continued to speak at universities, answer letters from ordinary citizens, and push policymakers to remember the people behind the policies. Eleanor once said, "It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness." And even in her final years, she remained aflame, gentle, steady, unwavering. She wasn't just living history, she was still making it. Eleanor Roosevelt passed away quietly on November 7th, 1962, at the age of 78. The world mourned not just a former First Lady, but a symbol of moral courage, empathy, and tireless advocacy. Her death marked the end of an era, but not the end of her influence. In many ways, Eleanor's voice only grew louder in the years that followed. She had never been flashy, never sought applause, but she left behind a legacy that continues to echo in classrooms, courtrooms, and halls of government. Her life's work, the fight for human dignity, equality, and justice, became the blueprint for countless activists and reformers who came after her. From the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to her fearless support for civil liberties, Eleanor's fingerprints remain on the very foundations of modern democracy. And yet, perhaps her most enduring contribution was not a law or a document, but an idea. That anyone, no matter how ordinary, could become a force for good. That leadership was not defined by titles or privilege, but by the courage to stand up for others, even when standing alone. She once wrote, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." It's easy to forget that Eleanor's own dreams began quietly, in a childhood filled with grief and shadows. But she believed in something larger than herself, and she used every ounce of her influence to lift others out of silence. In the years since her passing, she has been honoured with statues, schools, awards, and even her own US postage stamp. But her truest memorial lives not in marble or metal, but in movements, in voices that rise when others are silenced, in those who write, speak, march, and refuse to look away. Eleanor once said that human rights begin in small places, close to home. That's where she began too, a lonely girl in a big house, a quiet woman in a noisy world, a voice for the voiceless, and as you rest now, perhaps you'll carry a little of her strength into tomorrow. The quiet courage, the unwavering dignity, the belief that doing good is always worth it. Because sometimes the most powerful people in history aren't the ones who shout. They're the ones who never stop listening. It began quietly, just a few stocks dipping in price on an October morning in 1929. But within days the floor gave way. The New York Stock Exchange, once the beating heart of American optimism, collapsed under its own weight. Prices plummeted, panic erupted, and by the end of what would be called Black Tuesday, fortunes were erased, banks trembled, and the illusion of endless prosperity was shattered. The Roaring Twenties had promised so much: jazz, skyscrapers, fast cars, and faster profits. Many believed the good times would never end. Middle-class families bought stocks on margin, borrowing money to invest, convinced the market would only rise. But behind the glitter was something brittle. The wealth was uneven. The safety nets didn't exist. The foundation wasn't solid. When the market collapsed in October 1929, it wasn't just Wall Street investors who suffered. It was farmers in Kansas, factory workers in Detroit, teachers in Ohio. The ripples became waves, and the waves, a storm. Banks, untouched by modern regulations, began to fail. There was no insurance, no government backup, no recourse. When a bank went under, depositors lost everything. People rushed to withdraw their money, only to find locked doors and empty vaults. Trust vanished overnight. Factories halted production. Orders dried up. Employers laid off workers by the thousands. Within months, unemployment surged. Men in suits once proud to provide for their families now stood in lines for bread. Children went to bed hungry. Families sold their wedding rings, their furniture, even their shoes, anything to survive. The crash did not cause the Great Depression on its own, but it was the spark that lit the dry fields of an already unstable economy. It exposed the fragility of a system built on speculation, overconfidence, and unequal wealth. By the end of 1930, what had started as a market downturn had spiraled into a national, and soon, a global, catastrophe. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a collapse of the American dream. And while the numbers tell one story, billions lost, millions unemployed, the human stories would prove more powerful. Stories of dignity and despair, of survival against the odds, of a country that fell hard, but would find a way to stand again. As the 1930s unfolded, the Great Depression tightened its grip. By 1933, the United States faced unemployment rates nearing 25%. Millions of Americans suddenly found themselves without work, without wages, and without hope. The dreams of the 1920s had turned into long, desperate nights of hunger and uncertainty. In cities across the nation, breadlines became the new symbol of survival. Once proud men in worn coats and frayed hats stood in line for hours, waiting patiently for a bowl of soup or a slice of bread. These meals, offered by churches and private charities, were often the only food they'd see all day. Shantytowns began to appear on the edges of cities, makeshift communities of cardboard, scrapwood, and old metal. People called them Hoovervilles, a bitter nod to President Herbert Hoover, whose failure to respond meaningfully to the crisis left many feeling abandoned. These were not just homeless camps. They were testaments to survival. Families slept in cars, burned newspaper for warmth, and patched clothes until they could no longer be worn. Inside homes that still had roofs, life was filled with silent sacrifices. Mothers skipped meals so their children could eat. Shoes were stuffed with newspaper to stretch their use. Bartering returned, with goods traded for services, bread for milk, labour for coal. The economy had regressed to basics. Survival replaced ambition. For those who had once known security, the fall was especially hard. Former businessmen begged on corners. College graduates scrubbed floors. Children left school to work whatever jobs they could find. Dignity, once abundant, became a quiet casualty. And through it all, there was a shared understanding that something had broken, not just in banks or factories, but in the promise of the American system. The land of opportunity now looked like a land of hunger. Yet, there were moments of solidarity too. Neighbours shared what they had. Communities pooled resources to help each other endure. Though the pain was widespread, so too was the will to survive. This was no ordinary recession. It was an unravelling of life as people knew it. The question on every face was the same. How long would this last? And what would be left when it was over? While the cities struggled with unemployment and hunger, a different kind of catastrophe was unfolding in the American heartland. In states like Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico, the land itself was dying. What began as a drought soon escalated into one of the worst environmental disasters in US history. It would come to be known as the Dust Bowl. For decades, farmers had ploughed the prairie flat, tearing up native grasses to plant wheat and corn. In boom years, the soil yielded plenty, but those grasses had served a purpose, holding moisture, anchoring the earth against the wind. When the rains stopped in the early 1930s and the sun scorched the land dry, the bare soil turned to powder. Then came the wind. Great dust storms, some hundreds of miles wide, rolled across the plains like black walls. They swallowed farms, silenced animals, and turned day into night. Dust crept into every corner, through window cracks, under doors, into lungs. Children coughed up dirt. Cattle choked to death. Crops withered before they could grow. Families tried to endure, but many reached a breaking point. Packed into rickety trucks and sedans, entire communities fled westward, toward the promise of California. They were nicknamed Okies, regardless of their actual origin, and they found little welcome on the other end of the journey. The golden dream of California was often just another field, another day's work picking fruit for pennies, and another night spent sleeping under the stars. Photographers like Dorothea Lange captured the despair in unforgettable images. Mothers with lined faces, barefoot children clinging to their arms, eyes staring into an uncertain future. Writers like John Steinbeck gave them a voice in books like The Grapes of Wrath, documenting the quiet endurance of the displaced. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a weather event. It was a lesson in how human actions, left unchecked, could unravel nature's balance. Poor farming practices, driven by short-term profit, had turned fertile land into desert. And for the families who lived through it, the storms were more than physical. They were storms of identity, of purpose, of belonging. The earth had turned on them, and all they could do was keep moving, keep hoping. Some never returned. As the country spiraled deeper into despair, President Herbert Hoover remained firmly committed to a hands-off philosophy. A man of industry and self-reliance, Hoover believed that the economy would heal itself. He urged Americans to stay optimistic and resist panic. He called for voluntary cooperation, for charities and local governments to step up. But the suffering had outgrown speeches. Factories sat idle. Crops rotted in fields with no buyers. And yet the federal government hesitated. Hoover feared that direct relief would make citizens dependent. He believed too much government would undermine the American spirit. To millions of hungry families, those beliefs felt out of touch. As frustration grew, so did protests. One of the most heartbreaking moments came in 1932, when over 20,000 World War I veterans marched on Washington, demanding early payment of bonuses promised to them years before. They had served their country in battle, and now faced poverty at home. With no money, they built a tent city near the capital, peacefully waiting for an answer. Hoover refused to meet with them. Eventually, he ordered the camps cleared. General Douglas MacArthur led troops, tanks and cavalry included, against unarmed veterans, setting fires to tents and chasing families into the night. Newspapers captured the chaos. Photos of war heroes being driven away by their own government turned public opinion sharply. All across the country, people renamed their pain in protest. Shantytowns became Hoovervilles. Empty pockets pulled inside out were called Hoover flags. A piece of cardboard in a shoe, covering a hole, became a Hoover leather. These weren't just jokes. They were quiet cries for help. Hoover's intentions may not have been cruel. He truly believed in American individualism, in the old ideals of self-made success. But in a time of extraordinary need, his refusal to adapt became a national wound. By the time the 1932 election approached, it was clear that the country needed more than reassurance. It needed a new direction, a new voice, and a leader who was willing to meet the crisis head-on. That voice was already rising, with a soft accent and a strong promise. And soon, it would sweep across the country with the promise of a New Deal. On a cold March day in 1933, a calm, confident voice echoed across the airwaves. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inaugural address, and in just one sentence, he gave the nation something it had not felt in years: hope. FDR was unlike any president America had seen before. Stricken with polio more than a decade earlier, he could no longer walk without assistance. Yet, there was strength in his voice, warmth in his words, and steel behind his smile. He did not just promise change, he delivered it swiftly. In his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt launched an ambitious flurry of legislation aimed at stabilizing the economy and restoring confidence. One of his first actions was a national bank holiday, temporarily closing all banks to prevent further collapse. When they reopened days later, millions of Americans returned to deposit money instead of withdraw it. The tide had begun to turn. Roosevelt's vision was called the New Deal, a sweeping collection of programs and reforms designed to get Americans back to work, protect savings, and rebuild the shattered economy. It wasn't just policy, it was a lifeline. The Civilian Conservation Corps gave young men jobs planting trees, building trails, and restoring natural parks. The Public Works Administration and Works Progress Administration hired millions more to construct schools, roads, and bridges, many of which still stand today. The New Deal also brought relief to farmers through the Agricultural Adjustment Act and introduced reforms like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to protect bank deposits. These weren't handouts, they were investments in people, in dignity, and in rebuilding the nation from the ground up. Roosevelt spoke directly to the public through his fireside chats, radio broadcasts where he explained complex policies in simple, reassuring language. Families would gather around their radios as if listening to an old friend. Not everyone agreed with the New Deal. Some thought it went too far. Others thought it didn't go far enough. But for a nation lost in economic darkness, Roosevelt's leadership brought a flicker of light. The Great Depression was far from over. But now, Americans had something to walk with again: direction, purpose, and the belief that government could be a force for good. As the New Deal unfolded, something began to shift in the everyday rhythm of American life. It didn't happen all at once. There was no magic solution, no instant recovery. But for the first time in years, people started to move again. They had purpose, even if it came with a pickaxe or a paintbrush, a clipboard or a shovel. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCCC, sent young, unemployed men into forests and fields to plant trees, build fire breaks, and conserve national parks. For many, it was their first paying job. They lived in camps, sent money home, and found dignity in calloused hands. Across the country, you could see their work in the winding trails of the Blue Ridge Mountains or the timber shelters in state parks, lasting marks of their labour. Meanwhile, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, brought jobs to millions more. It wasn't just construction, though roads, bridges and schools were built at an astonishing pace. It also included writers, artists and musicians. Playwrights directed dramas in town squares. Painters filled post office walls with murals that celebrated working life. Historians interviewed former slaves, preserving voices that might have been lost forever. The Social Security Act, passed in 1935, created a financial safety net for the elderly and the unemployed. For the first time, people could imagine aging without absolute poverty. For many, it was revolutionary, proof that government cared not just about banks and business, but about people. Farmers, too, found support through subsidies and loans. Though controversial, the Agricultural Adjustment Act helped stabilise crop prices, giving rural families a chance to breathe again after years of drought and devastation. Radio became the nation's hearth. In every town and on every farm, families gathered to hear FDR's fireside chats. He spoke calmly, plainly, like a neighbour, walking Americans through policies and progress, reminding them they were not forgotten. Of course, hardship remained. Not all programs reached everyone. Racial and gender inequalities still left many out. But for a country once paralysed by fear, the New Deal offered something powerful: the sense that things were moving forward. Jobs didn't just pay bills, they restored identity. Projects didn't just build infrastructure, they rebuilt belief. And in the quiet progress of daily life, Americans began to stitch themselves back together. While the New Deal brought hope to millions, it also stirred controversy. For all its ambition, it wasn't universally praised. In fact, some of the loudest voices came from both ends of the political spectrum, some shouting that Roosevelt had gone too far, others insisting he hadn't gone far enough. Conservative critics, particularly business leaders and wealthy elites, accused Roosevelt of overstepping his authority. They saw the New Deal as an attack on free enterprise, a dangerous expansion of government into private affairs. To them, programs like Social Security and labour protections were steps towards socialism. Newspapers labelled FDR a dictator in disguise, warning that too much reliance on government would erode American values. On the other side, populist voices argued that the New Deal was too cautious. Senator Huey Long of Louisiana proposed a Share Our Wealth program, demanding heavy taxes on the rich to fund guaranteed incomes and housing for all. His speeches, fiery and emotional, drew massive crowds and threatened to split Roosevelt's base. Long was assassinated in 1935, but his ideas lingered, and others picked up the torch. Another critic was Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest with a nationwide radio show. At first a supporter of FDR, Coughlin turned on the president, calling him a pawn of bankers and failing the working class. His broadcasts mixed economic frustration with dangerous anti-Semitic rhetoric, revealing the darker undercurrents of public anger. The New Deal also faced resistance from the Supreme Court. In 1935, the court struck down key pieces of Roosevelt's programs, declaring several agencies unconstitutional. It was a major blow. In response, Roosevelt proposed a controversial plan to add more justices to the court, a move critics dubbed court packing. The plan ultimately failed, but the pressure worked. In time, the court became more favourable to New Deal legislation. Even within Roosevelt's own administration, there were tensions between those who wanted to go bolder and those who urged caution. Still, FDR navigated these waters with political finesse, never letting go of the central idea that government should be a force for stability and care. The New Deal had its flaws, but it also had defenders, millions of them. Because for every opponent shouting on the radio, there was a man who had found work, a widow receiving a cheque, or a farmer who could finally keep his land. Even in times of suffering, people find ways to express their humanity. The Great Depression was not only a crisis of economics, it was also a transformation of American culture. In dusty towns and crowded cities, amid hardship and hunger, a new wave of creativity took root. Photographers with government programs like the Farm Security Administration travelled across the country, capturing raw, unforgettable images of daily life. One photograph, Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange, became a symbol of the era, a worn woman, children clinging to her sides, her eyes full of worry and strength. These images didn't just document hardship, they dignified it. They reminded the nation that behind every statistic was a human soul. Writers responded too. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath told the story of the Joad family, forced to leave their Oklahoma farm and travel west in search of work. It wasn't just a novel. It was a cry for empathy, a mirror held up to the suffering of millions. Other writers, like Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston, used fiction to explore race, poverty, and identity in a deeply divided country. The Federal Writers Project, part of the New Deal, gave thousands of authors a way to survive and contribute. They documented oral histories, interviewed former slaves, and wrote state guides that captured the unique voice of each region. The government, for one rare moment, paid people to tell stories. Music also played its part. Folk singers like Woody Guthrie wrote ballads about dust storms, unemployment, and working-class resilience. His guitar famously bore the words, "This machine kills fascists." Songs like "This Land Is Your Land" became anthems not just of protest, but of promise. And then there was film. During those dark years, movie theatres became sanctuaries. For a few cents, Families could escape into fantasy, dancing with Fred Astaire, laughing with Charlie Chaplin, or journeying to Oz with Dorothy. Films like Gone with the Wind and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington reminded audiences of beauty, courage, and possibility. The arts during the Depression were more than entertainment. They were survival. They gave voice to the voiceless and vision to the weary. Even when pockets were empty, imagination remained full. And in those quiet moments of song, story, and cinema, America remembered who it was. By the late 1930s, the United States had begun to stabilize. The wild panic of the early Depression years had eased, thanks in part to the New Deal's reforms and to the resilience of the American people. But the economy remained fragile, and full recovery was still out of reach. Unemployment was high. Wages were low. Many families were still just getting by. Then came something no one wanted, but something that would finally shift the tide. War. In 1939, World War II erupted in Europe. At first, the United States remained officially neutral, though its factories soon began producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies for Allied nations. This production demand brought life back to idle assembly lines and opened doors for workers who had waited years for a job. And when the US entered the war in 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the transformation was swift and dramatic. Factories ran day and night, churning out planes, tanks, and ships. Millions of men were drafted into military service, while millions of women stepped into the workforce to fill their roles. Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol, not just of wartime industry, but of new possibilities for women's roles in society. The war effort ended the Depression in a way the New Deal alone could not. Unemployment dropped to record lows. People had money in their pockets again. Rationing reminded them of sacrifice, but for the first time in over a decade, the future looked brighter. Yet, the lessons of the Great Depression lingered. Americans had seen firsthand how quickly wealth could vanish, how deeply inequality could cut, and how critical it was to have protections in place. Social security remained. Labour rights stayed. The idea that government could, and should, step in to protect the vulnerable had taken root. The Depression had reshaped not just policy, but perspective. It taught a generation about humility, community, and perseverance. It changed how Americans thought about money, work, and fairness. And as the country moved into a new era, stronger, wiser, but forever marked, it carried with it the memory of bread lines, dust storms, and quiet endurance. Because survival was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452, not into wealth or nobility, but into quiet obscurity. He was the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman, raised in the Tuscan countryside in the small village of Vinci. There were no universities in his future, no formal schooling beyond the basics. But Leonardo had something no tutor could teach, an unquenchable hunger to understand everything. From the moment he could hold a pen, he observed the world with a kind of reverence, a dragonfly hovering over water, the curve of a shell, the way clouds gathered before a storm. He didn't just see nature, he studied it, deconstructed it, and asked how it worked. And then he wrote it down. His notebooks began as scattered sketches, tiny observations drawn in the margins of scraps and reused pages. But over time, they evolved into vast personal encyclopedias. They became places where he could think on paper. These weren't meant for the public. They weren't commissioned, edited, or even titled. They were his private experiments, filled with fragments, ideas, and images that danced across centuries. What makes Leonardo's notebooks extraordinary is not just the range of subjects: flight, anatomy, engineering, painting, physics, but the way they all blended into one another. He didn't build fences between disciplines. To him, the veins in a leaf and the veins in a human hand were echoes of the same design. Art and science were not opposites. They were twins, born from the same question: how does the world work? He asked questions that few in his time dared to ask. Could humans fly? How does the heart pump blood? Why do waves form in water? How do the planets move? For Leonardo, every answer led to 10 more questions, and every question found its way onto a page, drawn, written, annotated in a flurry of reversed script and hurried sketches. He carried his notebooks with him throughout his life, from Florence to Milan, from the royal courts to solitary studios. They were his true companions, the closest thing we have to a window into his thoughts. And through them, Leonardo wasn't just recording what he saw. He was teaching himself how to see. One of the first things a modern reader notices about Leonardo's notebooks is that they seem written in secret. The letters flow right to left, perfectly reversed, as if intended to be read only with a mirror. This curious style of writing has puzzled historians for centuries. Was Leonardo protecting his ideas? Was it a code, a form of concealment? Or was it simply a practical habit of a left-handed man, writing in a way that prevented the ink from smudging across the page? The truth may be a mix of all these things. What's certain is that his mirror writing contributes to the mystique of the notebooks, turning them into something that feels more like a portal than a journal. It's as if we are looking into the private engine room of a mind centuries ahead of its time. Leonardo didn't write for readers. His pages are scattered thoughts, experiments, questions, and flashes of brilliance. He would begin with a sketch of a bird in flight, then pivot to a diagram of a water pump, followed by a philosophical musing about the nature of light. There was no table of contents, no tidy organization. But that was the point. Leonardo's thoughts were non-linear, spiraling and evolving. His notebooks reflected the chaos of true curiosity. And what fills those pages is astounding. Notes on how to measure the sun's path through shadows, studies of human laughter, lists of books to read, questions to ask, machines to build. He wrote, "Describe the tongue of a woodpecker," a detail so specific, so odd, that it shows how deeply he wanted to understand every corner of creation. There's also beauty in the handwriting itself, elegant and fluid, dancing between sketches of anatomy, architecture and engineering. His lines aren't just functional, they're alive with motion and intent. What makes the mirror writing even more fascinating is that Leonardo never explained it. He left no key, no confession. He just wrote, privately, passionately, relentlessly. To open a page of his notebook is to stand at the edge of a mind in motion, spinning, spiraling, sketching its way toward understanding. And for those who dare to read backwards, the reward is a glimpse into the purest form of genius, not the answer, but the question. Centuries before the Wright brothers, before submarines slipped silently beneath the waves or robots moved in factories, Leonardo da Vinci was sketching machines the world had never seen and could barely imagine. In his notebooks, you'll find blueprints for inventions that read like science fiction. A helicopter powered by a spiral rotor, a tank with angled armour and rotating cannons, a machine for grinding convex lenses, even a robot knight designed to sit, wave its arms and move its jaw. Each drawn with precision, each impossibly ahead of its time. Leonardo was not an inventor in the modern sense. He rarely built what he designed, but his understanding of motion, force and mechanics was rooted in observation. He studied gears, pulleys, levers and springs, not just in theory, but in everyday objects. He dismantled clocks, watched mills turn and then asked, what else could this do? His design for the aerial screw, what we now recognize as a precursor to the helicopter, was based on the principle of air displacement. He believed that air, like water, could be gripped and pushed. Though no engine existed to power it in his time, the concept was sound. His armoured vehicle, drawn like a rolling turtle bristling with weaponry, was intended for battlefield intimidation, part machine, part psychological warfare. He imagined soldiers hidden safely within, advancing under cover of metal. Leonardo also envisioned tools for peace, canal systems, bridge designs, mechanical looms and water-lifting devices. His drawings often included not just a sketch, but notes on how the device would function, how weight would shift, how torque would distribute, how energy would flow. Yet many of these machines remained unrealized. The materials were not yet strong enough. The engines had not been invented. The world wasn't ready. But that never stopped him. For Leonardo, imagining was a form of freedom. His notebooks weren't about what could be built in his time, but what might be built someday. They were conversations with the future, drawn in ink and hope. And now, centuries later, engineers still study his pages, not just for what they contain, but for the way they think. Because in these machines that shouldn't exist, Leonardo reminds us of the power of ideas to transcend time. In a time when studying the human body was often considered taboo, risky, even heretical, Leonardo da Vinci pulled back the curtain with fearless precision. To him, the body was not a mystery to fear, but a masterpiece to understand. And in his notebooks, that understanding unfolds, layer by layer, muscle by muscle, bone by bone. Leonardo's anatomical drawings are some of the most detailed and accurate ever produced by hand. But they weren't just artistic studies. They were scientific dissections. In the quiet hours of the night, under dim candlelight, he performed autopsies on both humans and animals, often working in secret. Each incision was followed by a sketch. Each sketch, a question. Each question, another page. He mapped the human skeleton with an engineer's eye, measuring the tilt of the pelvis, the rotation of joints, the load-bearing structure of the spine. He explored how muscles contracted and how tendons transferred motion. His studies of the human foot, for example, are so thorough they rival modern medical illustrations. But Leonardo went deeper still. He examined the brain and the nervous system. He drew the heart, not as a symbol but as a machine. He was the first to accurately describe how the heart's valves function, using wax casts to study their shape. He even guessed, remarkably, that the heart worked like a double pump, circulating blood through a looped system. He sketched fetuses curled inside wombs, drew cross-sections of skulls and sinuses, and detailed the internal organs with delicate, careful lines. These weren't morbid fascinations. They were acts of reverence. For Leonardo, understanding the body was akin to understanding creation itself. And yet, most of this work was never published in his lifetime. His anatomical studies remained hidden in his notebooks, unseen by doctors who could have advanced their fields by decades. It's one of history's quiet tragedies, that so much insight lay in drawers and shelves, waiting to be discovered long after it could have helped. Still, what remains is extraordinary. Through ink and paper, Leonardo translated flesh into knowledge. He didn't just draw the body, he honoured it. And in doing so, he showed the world that beauty is not just skin deep. It's structural, mechanical, miraculous. To Leonardo da Vinci, nature was not a background for human life. It was the grand design. His notebooks reveal a man utterly captivated by the patterns of the natural world. He saw no boundary between the curve of a river and the curve of a spine, between the branching of a tree and the flow of blood through veins. Everything was connected. Everything followed form and function. And everything, he believed, could be understood through observation. He spent hours watching water, how it rippled, swirled, and flowed. He filled entire pages with studies of eddies and whirlpools, comparing their shapes to those found in hair, clouds, and wind. He wrote of how water moved with spirit, always seeking the path of least resistance, and when he drew it, it came alive, not just as liquid, but as a living language. Plants fascinated him too. He sketched leaves with meticulous care, noting how their veins mirrored river deltas. He observed how sunflowers turned their faces to the sun, how vines climbed toward the light. To Leonardo, even the smallest flower was an expression of geometry and light. He found order in chaos, the spirals of snail shells, the chambers of fruit, the flight of birds. All of it followed hidden rules, and he set out to find them. He studied proportions not only in the human form but in animals, in architecture, and in rock formations. His famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man was not just about anatomy, it was about harmony. It was his attempt to show that the human body itself reflected the architecture of the universe. Even weather patterns intrigued him. He tried to map the structure of storms and the behavior of winds. His sketches of turbulent air and crashing waves show not just scientific interest, but artistic awe. He wanted to understand nature not to control it, but to collaborate with it. Leonardo believed that beauty was not just pleasing, it was functional, that every line in nature served a purpose, and that by learning to see as nature sees, we could create better art, better machines, and perhaps better lives. In his notebooks, nature is not a subject, it's a teacher, and Leonardo was its most devoted student. To many, Leonardo da Vinci is remembered first and foremost as a painter, the mind behind The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. But what made his art so revolutionary wasn't just the pigment or the brushwork, it was the engineering behind the beauty. His notebooks reveal how every painting he created was first studied, tested, broken down, and rebuilt. He didn't just paint what he saw, he painted what he understood. Before sketching a face, Leonardo studied anatomy. Before drawing a landscape, he observed geology and light. He treated shadow and perspective not as artistic techniques, but as mathematical challenges. He believed that emotion could be captured through the smallest shifts in posture, the slightest tilt of a mouth or brow. And so, he rehearsed these details endlessly on paper. His notebooks are filled with sketches of faces, laughter, grief, suspicion, serenity, all drawn with a scientific eye for how muscles pulled skin into expression. He studied the way light curved across a cheekbone, how colour faded with distance, how perspective could guide the viewer's eye exactly where he wanted it to go. In his preparatory notes for The Last Supper, Leonardo mapped out the positions of every figure, their hand gestures, their emotional reactions to Christ's words. "One of you will betray me." Each character's body language was calculated to tell a story, not just to illustrate a scene, but to invite the viewer into a moment of tension and truth. And then there is the Mona Lisa, arguably the most studied face in the history of art. Her smile, so famously elusive, was no accident. Leonardo used a technique called sfumato, blending tones so softly that transitions became invisible. It mimicked the way the human eye sees in real life. Her gaze seems to follow you, not through magic, but through optics. Her expression shifts with the light, changing as you change. It's a living portrait, engineered to breathe. For Leonardo, painting was never separate from science. It was the final performance after hours of study and design. Every masterpiece was a solution to a complex problem of light, movement, balance, and truth. And in his notebooks, we see the equations behind the beauty. Leonardo da Vinci was not only an artist and scientist, he was also a lover of riddles, wordplay, and strange little jokes that often slipped between the cracks of his serious studies. In the margins of his notebooks, tucked beside mechanical diagrams and anatomical sketches, are glimpses of his playful and mysterious mind. He wrote cryptic phrases like, "The sun has never seen a shadow," a sentence that makes you pause. It feels like a riddle, and it is. The sun, as a source of light, cannot cast a shadow on itself. Simple, profound, philosophical. His notebooks are filled with these brain teasers, short riddles, puns, fables, even riddling recipes and observations that feel part poetry, part paradox. He'd write something like, "Describe a creature who walks backwards while eating, whose tracks always point the wrong way." And the answer? A chicken. It scratches backward while pecking the ground. Little puzzles like these tell us something deeper about Leonardo. He enjoyed thinking sideways. Beyond word games, his notebooks contain strange hybrid creatures, Dragons with mechanical limbs, lions with musical bellies, winged humans and armoured beasts. Some of these may have been inventions for pageantry, others symbols from dreams. Some were likely studies of movement and anatomy disguised as fantasy. Or perhaps they were something more, symbols of ideas he could not explain in words. Why did he hide so much? Why the mirror writing, the fragmented thoughts, the puzzles within puzzles? Some historians believe he was protecting his ideas from rivals or the church. Others think it was simply his nature, to guard his thoughts, to write for himself. And yet, these riddles invite us in. They suggest that Leonardo wasn't trying to push people away, but to draw them closer, to see if we too could think beyond the obvious. He seemed to live in a world where logic and imagination were never separate, where the mystery was just as valuable as the answer. Even today, scholars find lines in his notebooks that defy full understanding, half-finished thoughts, incomplete diagrams, sentences that trail off as if meant only for future readers. And maybe that's what Leonardo wanted, not to give us everything, but to give us something to chase. Leonardo da Vinci is estimated to have written over 13,000 pages during his lifetime, pages filled with drawings, theories, ideas, and dreams. Yet today, only about 7,000 remain. The rest are lost, scattered through history, misplaced, sold, stolen, or simply disintegrated with time. What we have is remarkable, but it's only half the story. The other half is missing, and perhaps always will be. His notebooks weren't published during his life. He never organized them into a single volume. Instead, he left behind bundles of loose sheets, diagrams and folded papers, some stitched together, others carried in trunks or passed from apprentice to apprentice. After his death in 1519, his papers fell into the hands of his faithful student, Francesco Melzi. Melzi tried to preserve them, but after his own death, the trail began to fray. Some notebooks were gifted, others sold off in pieces. Some were absorbed into private collections, misfiled in libraries, or cut apart for their drawings. The famed Codex Atlanticus, the largest surviving collection of Leonardo's writings, was once locked away, nearly forgotten. Another, the Codex Leicester, made its way through centuries of collectors before being purchased in 1994 by Bill Gates, who later digitized and shared it with the world. But others are still missing. Entire volumes referenced by Leonardo himself. His studies on optics, his treatises on painting, his explorations of flight, have yet to be found. Perhaps they never will be. Perhaps they sit in a forgotten drawer in a monastery or in a mislabeled box deep within an old European archive. What have we lost? Diagrams of machines that could have changed history? Observations that predated modern science by centuries? Ideas too radical for his time, waiting quietly for hours? And yet, what survives is enough to ignite wonder. Every time a missing page is rediscovered, it's like hearing Leonardo's voice again. Soft, curious, full of questions. The gaps in his notebooks aren't just absences, they're invitations. To explore, to imagine, to continue the conversation he started over 500 years ago. Because what Leonardo left behind was more than knowledge. He left a trail of breadcrumbs leading into the unknown. Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519, in the quiet service of the King of France, far from the streets of Florence and Milan, where he had once captured the soul of the Renaissance. He left behind no children, no school bearing his name, no single magnum opus that explained his vision. What he left instead were pages, thousands of them, filled with drawings, diagrams, riddles, and questions. A lifelong conversation between himself and the universe. Those notebooks, written in mirrored script and scattered across centuries, have outlived empires. They continue to whisper through time, not with final answers, but with endless curiosity. They are a reminder that Leonardo never saw the world as finished. To him, it was always unfolding, always teaching, always inviting the eye to look again. His sketches of flying machines, once fantasies, now echo in the sky as helicopters and drones. His anatomical drawings continue to awe medical students. His studies of water, light, and proportion still inform artists and architects. And his belief that art and science are not opposites but partners feels more relevant now than ever. Leonardo didn't write his notebooks for fame. He rarely published and never boasted. He scribbled in margins, tested ideas without knowing if they'd work, and followed his questions wherever they led. He was driven not by perfection, but by pursuit, not by mastery, but by wonder. And that, perhaps, is his greatest legacy. Because in a world that often demands certainty, Leonardo reminds us of the beauty of not knowing, of taking joy in the mystery, of observing more closely, asking more deeply, and imagining more boldly. His notebooks are not relics of the past. They are living invitations. Open one, and you can still feel his presence, a mind alive on the page, drawing, thinking, dreaming, a mind that believed the world was too intricate, too miraculous, to ever be fully understood, but that we must try anyway. Leonardo da Vinci did not leave us with a final theory or a finished system. He left us with an open notebook, and with it, a simple instruction: look closer. Ludwig van Beethoven was born in December 1770 in Bonn, a modest city along the Rhine River in what is now Germany. He came into a world already filled with expectations. His father, Johann, was a singer at the court chapel and a man who dreamed of turning his son into a prodigy like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But unlike Mozart's gentle upbringing, Beethoven's early years were hard. Johann was strict, often cruel, and drank heavily. When Ludwig was just a boy, he was pulled from his bed at night, forced to practice piano until his fingers were sore and his eyes heavy with sleep. There were no lullabies, only scales and stern corrections. His father wasn't nurturing his talent, he was demanding brilliance. Yet despite the pressure, something remarkable began to grow. Young Beethoven absorbed music like breath. He listened intently to the sounds around him, the chime of bells, the rhythm of footsteps, the murmur of voices. The piano, though a source of stress, became a place where he could speak freely. It was where his emotions could live outside of fear. By age 12, he was already publishing compositions. By 14, he was playing organ at the court. And though he lacked formal education, he had something greater: instinct, intensity, and the kind of imagination that could not be taught. He was a quiet, often lonely child, misunderstood by those around him. But in music, he found something stable, something pure. Not just entertainment, but refuge. When his mother died during his teenage years, the burden of caring for his younger siblings fell on him. His father slipped further into alcoholism, and Ludwig was forced to take on adult responsibilities far too early. Through it all, he continued to compose, to play, to dream. Beethoven's early life was not gilded with luxury or guided by loving mentors. It was shaped by hardship, discipline, and an urgent need to express what he could not say out loud. And in that crucible of silence and pressure, the spark of genius began to burn. Long before his world would fall silent again, Beethoven had already learned to hear with more than just his ears. He had learned to feel music. When Beethoven arrived in Vienna at the age of 21, the city was alive with music. It was the cultural epicenter of Europe, where the streets hummed with melody and salons rang with conversation. The great composers of the time, Mozart, Haydn, and Salieri, had all walked these same cobbled roads. For Beethoven, this was not just a change of scenery, it was the beginning of transformation. Vienna welcomed him not as a polished gentleman, but as a wild, moody genius with unkempt hair and a fiery spirit. He wasn't interested in charming the elite with small talk. He let his music speak instead. And it roared. His improvisations at the piano left audiences stunned. He would sit at the keyboard and unleash entire worlds. Tender, fierce, stormy, divine, often with eyes closed, as if channeling something beyond him. Though he studied briefly with Joseph Haydn, their relationship was tense. Beethoven respected him, but sought his own voice. He wasn't content to follow in anyone's footsteps, not even Mozart's. Where others refined, he reinvented. He took classical forms and bent them, shaped them, exploded them, injecting emotion where there had once been elegance, rawness where there had been restraint. Vienna's aristocracy quickly noticed. Wealthy patrons offered him lodging, commissions, introductions, but Beethoven refused to become dependent on anyone. He accepted support on his own terms, valuing freedom over comfort. He once said, "There is no greater wealth than to live without servitude." As his reputation grew, so did his ambition. He wasn't writing for the court or for public approval. He was writing for truth. Every composition was a conversation with himself, a map of the soul's terrain. His early sonatas and symphonies dazzled audiences, blending structure with storm, tradition with revolution. But beneath the applause, something else stirred, a faint ringing in his ears, a sound that did not belong. At first, he brushed it off. But Vienna, the city of sound, was about to become quieter for Beethoven in a way no one could imagine. Still, in this golden period, before silence fell, Beethoven built his foundation. He captured Vienna's heartbeat and made it his own. The city gave him sound, and he would give it back, transformed into something eternal. It began with a hum, soft, persistent, just beneath the edge of perception. Beethoven was still in his 20s when he first noticed it. A faint ringing in the ears, an occasional dullness, the struggle to hear voices in a crowded room. At first, he dismissed it, hoping it would pass. But it didn't. The ringing grew louder. Conversations became harder to follow. High notes lost their sparkle. Music, once crystal clear, began to feel distant. And then came the unthinkable realization: he was going deaf. For a composer, this was not just a physical ailment, it was a spiritual catastrophe. Music was his life, his identity, his way of communicating with the world. Without it, who was he? How could he continue? Beethoven kept his condition a secret. He didn't want pity, nor did he want the world to know that its greatest musical mind was slowly losing the very sense that defined him. He avoided social gatherings, grew irritable, withdrawn. Friends noticed the change but didn't understand it. The silence he experienced was not just in his ears, it was creeping into his entire life. In the privacy of letters and diary fragments, he poured out his despair. He confessed his shame, his fear, his isolation. He felt trapped, unable to speak his truth, unable to escape it. He once wrote, "Oh, how humiliating for me when someone standing next to me hears a flute in the distance and I hear nothing." And yet, even as silence took hold of his outer world, the music within him did not fade. In fact, it seemed to grow louder, more urgent. He began composing not for the applause of others, but as a form of survival. Every note was a rebellion against the silence. Every melody, a thread pulled from memory and imagination. He no longer needed to hear instruments to understand how they would sound. He knew the mechanics of harmony so deeply, so intuitively, that he could compose entire symphonies in his mind. His hearing may have betrayed him, but his genius remained untouched. What Beethoven lost in sound, he gained in depth, and the silence, once feared, would soon become the backdrop for his most profound creations. In the autumn of 1802, Beethoven retreated to the village of Heiligenstadt, just outside Vienna. The doctors had advised him to rest, to escape the pressures of the city, to find peace in the countryside. But Beethoven didn't find peace. What he found instead was the full weight of his growing deafness, and the emotional collapse that came with it. There, surrounded by the rustling of leaves he could barely hear, and the birdsong fading into silence, Beethoven wrote a letter. It was addressed to his brothers, but he never sent it. It was part confession, part last will, part desperate cry. Today, we know it as the Heiligenstadt Testament. In it, Beethoven poured out the torment he had hidden from the world. He wrote of his isolation, his humiliation, and the unbearable irony of a musician going deaf. He spoke of how he had avoided people, fearing they would discover his secret. He admitted to thoughts of suicide, not from weakness, but from despair that he could no longer live the life he imagined. But then, the letter takes a turn. Beethoven writes, "Only my art, it seemed to me, held me back." The music, unwritten, unplayed, but alive inside him, was what kept him going. He realized he could not die, not yet. He had more to give, more to say. And so, he made a decision. If he could not return to the life he once knew, he would create a new one. Not one built on what he had lost, but on what he still possessed. After writing the Testament, Beethoven emerged changed. He had touched the edge of despair and returned with a new resolve. He would not compose to please. He would compose to tell the truth, his truth. What followed was a shift in his music. It became deeper, bolder, more emotional. He stopped imitating the past and began shaping the future. The Heiligenstadt Testament was never mailed, never read by its intended recipients in his lifetime, but it remains one of the most human documents ever written by a genius, a window into the soul of a man who, in the silence of loss, chose creation. He had faced the abyss, and instead of falling, he listened. After the emotional reckoning of Heiligenstadt, Beethoven did not retreat. He roared. What followed was one of the most powerful creative outpourings in music history. Though his hearing continued to fade, Beethoven began composing with more intensity, more vision, and more daring than ever before. He was no longer writing for approval. He was writing from a place that defied the physical world. His third symphony, the Eroica, marked this turning point. It was grand, defiant, and deeply personal. Longer and more complex than any symphony of its time, it broke all the rules. Originally dedicated to Napoleon, Beethoven later tore off the dedication when Napoleon declared himself emperor. For Beethoven, the music was no longer about heroes, it was about humanity. Triumph, grief, and resilience swirled through its notes. He had begun to speak a new musical language, one forged in struggle. Then came the Fifth Symphony, with its unforgettable four-note opening, da-da-da-dum. Beethoven called it Fate Knocking at the Door. Short, stark, and unforgettable, it opened with tension and refused to let go. It was as if Beethoven had compressed the entire drama of existence into one sharp gesture: question, conflict, transformation, and triumph. Even now, centuries later, it echoes like a heartbeat. These weren't just beautiful compositions, they were emotional statements. Beethoven was writing from the core of himself, from a space beyond sound. He could no longer hear the music the way others could, but he knew how it would feel. He didn't need to listen with his ears. His mind had become its own concert hall. While others composed for the salons of the elite, Beethoven was composing for the human soul. He pushed boundaries of form, of harmony, of what music could express. His pieces were filled with contrasts, rage and peace, despair and hope, thunder and whisper, and always, beneath it all, a sense of struggle. A man wrestling with fate, with silence, with the limits of his own body, and transcending them through art. Beethoven's deafness no longer defined what he had lost. It became the doorway to a deeper world, one that few could enter. And through his music, he invited us to follow. By the time Beethoven entered his final decade, his world had narrowed. His deafness was near total. Communication required notebooks. His health was fragile, his finances uncertain, and many of his closest companions had faded away. But his mind had never been more alive. Out of this solitude came his late style, music more introspective, more spiritual, and more mysterious than anything he had written before. These works weren't designed to impress audiences or win applause. They were inner dialogues, prayers without words, questions without clear answers. His late piano sonatas drifted far from tradition. Some were whisper-soft, others exploded with sudden intensity. In one moment, he would linger on a single note like a breath held too long. In the next, the music would leap unexpectedly, as if chasing a thought it couldn't quite catch. He wasn't following form anymore. He was following feeling. Even more astonishing were his late string quartets, works that baffled his contemporaries and still challenge musicians today. Their structure bends and twists, their melodies arrive like distant memories, and their silence speaks as loudly as their sound. In the Cavatina from Opus 130, Beethoven notated the passage beklemmt, meaning oppressed or choked with emotion. When played, it feels like the heart of a man remembering pain he can no longer express in words. These were not compositions for a public hall. They were letters to something beyond, as if Beethoven, unable to hear the world, had begun writing for eternity itself. Listeners at the time were confused. Some thought he had gone mad. Others didn't know what to make of the strange harmonies, the sudden pauses, the deep sadness that lingered in every phrase. But Beethoven didn't explain. He didn't need to. He once said, "What I have in my heart must come out. That is the reason why I compose." And in these final years, that truth burned brighter than ever. His late works were not swan songs. They were meditations, acts of courage from a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to feel. Through silence, Beethoven had learned to listen more deeply, and in doing so, he composed music no one else dared to imagine. By the early 1820s, Beethoven was completely deaf. He could not hear the laughter of friends, the hum of conversation, or the sounds of his own footsteps. And yet, from within this vast silence, he began to compose what many consider the greatest symphony ever written, his ninth. It was unlike anything the world had heard, a symphony that was not just grand in scale, but revolutionary in design. For the first time in history, a symphony would not end with instruments alone, but with the human voice. Beethoven would summon a chorus to sing words of joy, brotherhood, and divine unity. The idea had lived with him for decades. He had long admired Friedrich Schiller's poem Ode to Joy, with its vision of humanity united under the heavens. Now, in the final stretch of his life, Beethoven made that vision real, in sound he could not hear, but could still feel. The Ninth Symphony is a journey. The first three movements explore conflict, beauty, and tension. They swell and crash like oceans stirred by unseen forces. And then comes the finale, an explosion of light. Cellos and basses begin the theme, low and solemn, rising like a voice learning to speak. The orchestra echoes. Then, at last, the human voice enters. O Freunde, nicht diese Töne. O friends, not these tones, the soloist proclaims. What follows is a hymn to joy so pure, so powerful, that it has become an anthem of hope for the world. It is played at celebrations, at the fall of walls, at moments when nations seek peace. At the premiere in Vienna in 1824, Beethoven stood near the stage. He could not hear the orchestra or the thunderous applause that followed. A singer gently turned him to face the crowd so he could see their ovation. Tears filled the eyes of those in the audience. The man who had created this miracle of sound had not heard a single note of it with his ears. But Beethoven had heard it, where it mattered, in the deepest chamber of the soul. The Ninth Symphony was not just a composition. It was a triumph over silence, a declaration that joy, even in darkness, is always worth singing. On March 26, 1827, Ludwig van Beethoven took his final breath. Outside, a storm was raging, lightning cracking across the Viennese sky, thunder rolling like timpani. Some say he raised his fist as if to challenge the heavens one last time. Others say he passed in silence, as he had lived for so long. Either way, the world lost a titan. Tens of thousands gathered for his funeral. Students, aristocrats, musicians, strangers, all drawn by the gravity of what he had been. As his casket passed through the streets of Vienna, the city fell silent, not out of formality, but out of awe. Beethoven left behind more than music. He left a new way of thinking about art, about struggle, and about what it means to create from the core of one's being. He had reshaped the purpose of the composer, not as a servant to royal courts or social trends, but as a voice of the individual soul. He proved that greatness does not require perfection, that even as his body failed him, his mind soared higher. That silence, instead of ending him, deepened him. He did not write music despite his deafness. He wrote music through it, because of it. Future generations studied his scores like sacred texts. Brahms wept over his symphonies. Wagner called him the bridge between mortal and divine. Mahler said that in every note you could hear the pulse of the universe. Even modern filmmakers, jazz artists and rock musicians still draw from his ideas. The Ninth Symphony became more than a piece of music. It became a symbol of resilience, of unity, of what the human spirit can achieve in defiance of suffering. Its ode to joy has been used to mark both victory and healing. It has echoed in concert halls, in times of peace, and in the aftermath of war. Beethoven didn't live to see how far his influence would reach. But perhaps he didn't need to. He once said, "Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy," and in his silence he had already said everything. The man who lost the world of sound gave us a world of meaning, and in doing so became immortal. Beethoven's life is often remembered as a tragedy turned triumph. A deaf man who composed the most powerful music the world has ever known. But his story is more than inspiration. It's a question. How did he do it? How does one hear music with no sound? The answer lies not in the ear, but in the imagination. By the time he was composing his final works, Beethoven could no longer hear a single note. Yet he still wrote entire symphonies, quartets, and sonatas, complex pieces filled with nuance, rhythm, and harmony. He did not guess what they might sound like. He knew. He had internalized sound to the point that his mind could orchestrate every detail, as if his body had become an instrument of its own. To feel vibration, he bit down on a wooden stick attached to the soundboard of his piano. He watched the strings move, felt the resonance in his bones. But more than that, he heard in memory. Every chord, every interval, every crescendo lived inside him. His compositions weren't echoes of things he'd once heard. They were born of intuition, of logic, of deep inner music that transcended the physical senses. His silence was not a void. It was a canvas. And in that silence, he painted sound the way a blind painter might dream colour. Beethoven teaches us something profound about creativity, that it does not come from comfort or convenience or perfect conditions. It comes from within, from persistence, from the refusal to surrender what is most sacred, even when the world offers nothing back. He reminds us that limitations do not define us. That hardship, when met with courage, can become a gateway to something extraordinary. To this day, when we listen to his music, we are not simply hearing notes arranged in time. We are entering his world, a world where sound is shaped by silence, where joy rises from pain, where the most beautiful music ever written was never heard by the man who gave it to us. And perhaps that is Beethoven's final gift, not just his music, but the reminder that some of the richest truths are not heard with the ear at all, but with the soul.